very excited to have Karen here. Karen has a long and storied history at Google. She joined Google in 2002 and was here through 2011 and worked as a media liaison. Really launched a lot of the things that you've taken for granted here at Google, including the blog and our Twitter account. And much of our outbound has flown through her and come from her ideas. She later went on to be an editorial director at Twitter and was there, I think, 6 years?
About 5.
About 5, we'll give her 5. And so she's had really kind of a firsthand experience at some of the biggest names in tech and really the world. And you've had a front row seat to that. And it's been interesting to see your career flourish and grow even after you left this small little company. And it was good to see your stories when you wrote this book, which is Taking the Work Out of Networking, which is really an introvert's guide to networking. One thing that's been fun for me to see is that I feel like everybody knows Karen, or they've known of her, or she has been one step away from other people that we know. I managed to go through this book and really take a lot out of it. And so I'm glad you're here to talk about it. And
me too.
We probably have a few introverts in the room who could benefit from it. So first, why don't you tell us, why did you write a book for introverts?
I'm thrilled to be here. I love Google, and I've long loved Google, so it's great to be back in the Plex, as it were. I wrote the book to see if I could break down and detail the things I have done to create a sort of big virtual network for myself. And it wasn't that I woke up one day and said, wow, I have a fantastic network. It's more that other people over the years have often said to me, you seem to know everybody. And I would be the one, for the hot years in Google, as Louis said, I was here from 2002, when hiring really turned up and Google was getting 1 million resumes a year. It might still, I don't know, but there was a point where that started to happen. And I was getting inundated from all my other contacts everywhere. I want to work at Google, I want to work at Google. And I generally will say yes to most meetings or calls or hangouts or something. I would connect with everybody that had questions. The answers would vary, obviously, depending on a lot of things. But during that time, as I was sort of telling people maybe how to go about navigating Google and applying to Google and thinking about it, it sort of led me to think, how can I codify how people not just do a job search, but also, be able to call on other people when they have questions, when they need something, because we all have those moments. So fast forward a few years, and I wrote a column for what used to be called Back Channel, which is now part of Wired. Stephen Levy was the editor. And it was essentially building off of my many meetings with either job seekers or people that wanted to move into tech businesses from some more traditional industry or something like that. And I kind of went through the same thing, and I thought, I need to really kind of detail this. So fast forward again, I've left Twitter, got a book agent, and a couple of New York editors called me. And we kicked around a bunch of ideas for books. And finally, someone asked me, what is the one piece of advice that you find yourself always giving people? And I said, it is to build a network for life. Introvert didn't really come into it, except I'm an introvert. So I've never not built a network on the basis of me being a famous celebrity. I much more prefer, not only am I not that, but I much more prefer a kind of a background role. And I still have done it, and so that's what made me think, okay, let me kind of break this out for people. So the book is for introverts, but not only introverts, because in the process of doing it, I discovered everybody hates networking. Everybody hates the idea. Everybody thinks of it as a chore and that it's phony. And, it doesn't seem to yield much very effectively. So I thought, this is the way I want to go, is make something, approach it in a way that's more useful for all kinds of people.
You talk about networking being a chore. I think most people use it, they don't like it. They don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And that's especially true for introverts. Many times when you talk about networking, you're talking about it from the phase of a job seeker.
Yes.
And yet there are people who have stable jobs who don't plan on leaving. So who cares? So why would somebody who's in a stable job want to do networking? And Why is it important for them?
Who among us thinks you have a stable job for the rest of your working life? I mean, honestly, I've talked to people who did think that until their job wasn't stable, right? Until you name any kind of change happened that they weren't happy with, or, there lots of circumstances happen. And so the idea that it's a kind of one and done thing, it just isn't reality for most of us anymore. But I also think the value of one's kind of personal connections and contacts, or the subtitle, making connections that count, is really something we do want to be able to call on people who have subject matter expertise and experience in a specific thing when we're looking for that specific thing. So job's a big category, but not only. But I have literally talked to people who have said, I'm coming to you because I let my network go. How do I start again? Because I've been in a job I've been happy in for a long time, and now I need to make a change.
So one thing I've run into, and you talked about it in the book, was that there's this perception that networking, or the process of it, requires you to not be yourself and be fake, to put an artificial representation of yourself and filter out the things you don't think people want to know.
Yeah.
Do you find that that's true, or do you find by being your true self in full, you have the most access to new people and new ideas?
I think when you're authentic and you're not in the clutch of kind of fear and neediness and, feeling the need to be in a transactional mode with someone you don't know at all, that's a position of vulnerability, to be sure. That's not fun for the person who's in it. But, the more you find common points of connection, even with people you don't know, the easier it will be to remember later, I like that person, was easy to talk to, or I like that person, maybe they're going to know about this, or I know they do know about this other thing I'm asking, a different role, a different company, they've lived in another country I'm thinking of, whatever it is. That person is approachable. And I think that's the way that we all want to connect with each other. And so, why not sort of put it to practice, as we go along?
Now, in 2000, as the dot-com bubble was popping, if you look at your LinkedIn, they start to be, instead of 5-year chunks, they're like 1-year chunks, right? And I think a lot of people in the Valley, especially, you talk about it, that they have 3-year job cycles. Mm-hmm. So you came to the end of one of these 1-year job cycles, and it was really hard to find a dedicated role, and it was for a lot of your peers. And you talk about this story of you creating almost like a support group where you connect with each other and say, so how's it going? Mm-hmm. And as you told it, that eventually led you to a contract role at Google a couple years later. Mm-hmm. So why was this your job? How did it fall to you to put together this group? Because that shows to me someone who isn't necessarily that introvert, stay-at-home role, but more of a leader. How did you get this?
Well, I don't think those are opposite things. So I am an introvert, stay at home when it comes to, if I've had kind of a long stretch of being out and about, the mental calculation is how soon can I go home, right? Or like, when can I get some respite from being out in the world? But I go back out into the world. So the thing I really am at root is a connector of people. And I also thought it was true, there was this big downturn in 2000, 2001. Nobody was hiring. Jobs just melted away. I mean, it was a first for the Bay Area, for Silicon Valley. And so I knew a bunch of people who had been looking, and now there were no jobs listed anymore. So I thought, well, we need to kind of keep each other going. So I asked a few people I knew, some better than others, some former work colleagues. I think there were, 8 of us or so. And we would meet around my dining room table in the city. I think we met weekly, but it might have been less frequent. But the idea was, talk over, what leads you're finding, if you need help describing yourself, or if you want to be, for the time being, a consultant, what are your services, what's your pricing? Let's just kick it around, because we got to kind of feel our way through this. And that group did meet for probably the better part of 2 years on and off, just because it was a long period of people, practicing their elevator pitch, or maybe I'm going to be interested in this and I got to go do some research about that. It was it was a good lesson for me. And I think I do turn to other people for advice and for guidance. And I want those people to be not random, but people who know the environment I'm in, know what I'm interested in. And that was kind of the purpose of this group too. So I did move from my support group at the dining room table to a contract as a marketing writer for Google in 2002. However, I knew the first VP of comms here, whose name was Cindy McCaffrey, because I'd worked with her at 2 other companies prior. So I'd kept up with her. I'd visited Google, not on University, but in the first of the office park complexes just over here. And, the other thing I had been doing is freelance writing for trade publications. So I actually I reviewed Google as a search engine in, I don't know, something like maybe 2000, just as a freelance thing. And I remember that's how I knew Google, is that I looked at it and it was so many leagues better than all the other 20 search engines that had come before. So I thought, wow, they've got something. This thing really works. I gave it a good review. Anyway, I came to have lunch with Cindy one day, and I thought, wow, that's, it's interesting. And I just kept in touch with her. I did call her when I was on the lookout for freelance work. And initially she said, we just hired a marketing writer, so right now we're fine, but I'll keep you in mind. And then she called me back and said, actually, we're drowning in work, and that guy had to go on a leave. How soon can you come down? And so it was September 3rd, 2002. I do not forget this date. And it wasn't just a matter of Cindy, then I had to meet other people on the team and start talking about specific projects I'd be doing. And within a couple of weeks, I thought, this is where I want to be. And rather than work at home and send things in, I said, I'm just going to be here and make them get sick of me. I mean, I'm going to be here and remind them that I want a job here. And it took a while, but that was how it happened.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, you made a comment about Google getting 1 million job applicants a day trying to get in.
Yeah.
So that sounds like the world's changed a bit. You've gone from 2000 where there's not enough jobs available and trying to get into a small company of 600 or so when you started,
yeah,
to literally tens of thousands when you left. And I hate to say it, but it's gotten bigger since you left.
I know. I left at 50,000 when the Motorola acquisition went through.
Mm-hmm. and so there's been a lot of change, and you were kind of a front row seat to a lot of that change.
Yeah.
So how did that change your approach to both networking and communication? Because now you have this tremendous stage, and you have all these people who want your attention, and you have to be a filter as well.
Right. So on the first part of that, the thing that I learned at Google that I'd never worked for a company that had grown so big so fast. People had said to me, you have to be kind of entrepreneurial when you're at Google. You have a lot of room to explore and make things happen. I didn't know what that meant really at the beginning. It didn't really sink in. But the thing that I did discover pretty early, I was part of the communications team when I finally did get a full-time job. Communications as a team has a wider view of a company than almost any other team, because between all the people on their beats, they're aware of corporate stuff, product stuff, employee stuff. I mean, as a group collectively, they have a really wide horizon, which I did like, because I worked with everybody. I was an editor. I was essentially like the editor that became the editor of the Google blog. And so in that process, not only was I working with different people along the way, but I also realized as I became friendly with people, they became like my brain trust to help me understand what's happening around the company. Not secret launch plans, but more like early on, I have liberal arts degrees. I mean, I really didn't even understand a search index in the beginning. So if I was friendly with an engineer who did know, and they did, I could, help me understand this. And out of that came the original thing that was called Google Zeitgeist, which is now Google Trends. But at the time, it was a hand-picked from the index printed out 50 sheets of paper highlighting things that we thought were spikes. I mean, it was primitive, but he was very patient with me and helped me understand what that was about. So then when I had questions about things like that, I could go to someone like him and say, does this make sense to you? Or, as I began to understand more, he was like a good reality check. And so were other people across, legal and product marketing and just different ones. I mean, Peter has been here all this time, and we used to work on the mighty Google research blog, which was anomalous to the other blogs, but it was awesome. It had its own personality. So I think you have to have your internal network, especially in a big company, that are just informal friends. Companies not this big, you can imagine people saying at the water cooler, I'm so excited about that launch tomorrow, and somebody's saying, really? Does legal know about that yet? Because I'm not, that I hope doesn't happen here anymore, but you can appreciate that it has a value to ongoing business, but it also just enriches your experience so that you understand all the parts of the business and who's doing what, and that people are looking after and focused on different things. To me, it's very enriching, and I don't know how you can navigate in a company today and not do that.
And so networking itself is kind of a private activity in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
It's talking one-to-one.
It's not broadcast.
You mentioned Peter by his first name because to you, he's Peter. To a lot of other people in this room, he's that guy sitting over there. And so you have a different level of knowledge based on how well you know them. So you were able to see Google transform in two ways.
Yeah.
First was going from private company to public.
Mm-hmm.
And the second in terms of having that one-to-one relationship with reporters to the point where you can broadcast on your own with a blog and Twitter later. So this is kind of a dual-pronged question. Kind of take us through those stories, because a lot of people weren't in the room. Talk about going public at Google and Twitter. You did it twice.
Yes.
And then talk about how did you get a company to go public with a blog and start to share with the rest of the world?
So Google is a fantastic story about this, because Google bought Pyra Labs in 2003, which was Blogger. And from the beginning, I mean, the comms team, we all said, this is what we should use for our own publishing, our sort of corporate publishing mechanism, instead of press releases, which was the old-fashioned way. Google didn't put out that many press releases to begin with, and it's a very arcane way of doing things, not Google style. So there was not a lot of opposition to the concept at all. The question was more, well, what's the sort of approval flow and the workflow and things like that? And it took a while, because I think we first kind of announced and published or unveiled the Google blog in the spring of 2004, after we had filed for the IPO. So the lawyers were great, but they were also a little wary about, this all has to be, sort of under the rules of business as usual. No wild stuff here on blogs. At that time, people were very anxious about corporate blogs, because typically it was more like individual employees doing it, right, rather than a company. In fact, the blogger guys at the time said, a company can't have a blog. And I said, it's just a publishing platform. It's not a, yes, they can, and then we're going to. So eventually we got going. But if you look back at the very beginning of the Google blog, it's like, here's a recipe from Charlie. It was the safest, most non-newsworthy stuff, because that was all we could sort of get past the lawyer. So it took getting past the IPO, and then getting some cadence, and then eventually I could, kind of institute an editorial calendar. Because I was on the comms team, I made sure all the comms people were signed off on the individual topics. Individual team members from the relevant team would be the writer or at least drafter of the thing, because they were the subject matter experts. That was from the beginning. And I didn't realize it then, but Google really kind of paved the way for what other companies do in terms of their own news and information, because I made sure it wasn't just product announcement. I wanted interesting stories to come through. And then over time, more countries, more products, all wanted their own blogs. And at one point, I think we were up above 200 something. And that's why there's now this streamlined thing that my wonderful successor, Emily Wood, has put into place. But and Twitter, adding Google as a Twitter account was something I made a case for internally. It was 2009. Twitter was already, the techies were already busy on Twitter, and so were tech reporters. So that was my argument. We had to have a presence there because tech reporters were using it already. And initially I got some pushback because by 2009, Google had plenty of public channels. And I just said, because of the kind of company we are, we have to be there. And initially it was, well, we don't have head count. And I said, you don't need head count. I can do this. It's not a 24/7 job. And so I did get the okay to do it, which was awesome. And the first tweet was, I'm feeling lucky in binary, which was it was a big hit at the time, just because it was different and it sort of announced us. So I'm happy that I was part of that, and that's how those things happened. Now, Twitter is like a different generation, practically, in terms, as a company publishing its own stuff. Yes, of course, they had a Twitter account, but by the time I got there, the founders were all gone. So they didn't have a sort of voice of Twitter biz anymore. And it was frankly a bigger challenge to have Twitter, the company, represented on its own platform, ironically. It was a lot, and they had less to talk about, and there was less they wanted to talk about. They were having, it was not a great time at Twitter back then. So it was tougher to get a cadence going, but I did kind of institute the same idea of principles about what the blog should be talking about and all the names that should be attached to posts and stuff. And then it has morphed a lot even since I've left in terms of how they do it. I mean, so much has changed really even in the last 5 years in terms of sort of company news and information.
So we talked about this a little bit over lunch, but working at both Twitter and Google, you've had to work with some seriously introverted leadership, right? And so how do you encourage people to whom networking is not very easy and speaking publicly is not very easy to actually go out and do that? How do you tell them this is a valuable thing and get them to engage?
Well, fortunately, that didn't all fall to me to do. I found, my goal was always to be genuine and helpful, honestly. And so I was in situations where I could do that, but I was not the advisor talking about media opportunities as much. I did know that someone like a Stephen Levy, who's an editor at large at Wired now, who's the guy who wrote the big book about Google, he was a perfect kind of comfort level for lots of people here, and that made it a lot easier for him to get access and write that book. And if you don't know it, I think it's still a good book to explain how Google approaches problems and thinks about things.
And that's in the Plex.
In the Plex. So it depended on, I would never be in a situation to push, a broadcast TV interview. Other people would do that. But I could suggest maybe the more offbeat sources that had credibility, or the more interesting ones that were not necessarily the biggest following, but maybe had influence in areas that the founders or some of the executives would care about.
You talked about blogs and obviously Twitter having its own Twitter account, which brings us into this new generation, like you said, of social networking.
Yeah.
And so in your book, you go through and talk about a mix of real life networking and also social networking. What do you think that percentage should look like? Can someone get away with being a keyboard jockey and just doing email and just tweeting just enough and just posting Instagram just enough so that you have the kind of loose ties that you reference constantly in your book?
Yeah, you can. That's part of the point of my book is I wasn't conferred with a lot of power and visibility that people would want to connect to me. Which is typically how, that's how maybe Tony Robbins does it, right? But for most of us, it's more, I mean, you want to be your genuine self and be open to meeting new and interesting people now and again. Essentially, it's not a 24/7 calling. So I do believe that the various social channels make it possible to discover and meet and have relationships with people, with many more people that was ever possible without that, for sure. But it's not a numbers game either, and so there's nothing that can be sort of a one-to-one exchange, however the other connections work. And in a way, I learned that at Google too, because it was the first kind of truly international company I worked for, where we'd have global offsite once a year, and everybody would be together for a week, and we'd socialize. And even if you only worked with somebody or other on your team a little bit, just the fact that you'd had some social interaction and some time together for a week a year really strengthened the online relationship, right, that you'd go back to. So I do think that's valuable. But we're so used to sort of these sort of momentary touches with people, whether it's a Twitter DM or even just an open tweet and a few of your friends respond and you have a little thread. LinkedIn was kind of built for a certain kind of online connection, obviously, and it works pretty well for that, for its main purpose. Instagram, like Twitter, lets you follow people you don't know, right? And you can have a way to, contact them. These are unlike Facebook, which was not really designed for this sort of asymmetrical networking. That was much more, your friends and family. So I do talk in the book about making use of those, whichever ones you're comfortable on and where people you're connecting to are on, so that, part of my day every day is probably a few Twitter DMs, a couple of text messages, a couple of Facebook messenger posts or something like that, where I'm just saying, hey, thought of you, saw this, how are you, let's talk soon. It's not a heavy lift, and it's not an obligatory response. It's more just like, I'm thinking of you right now.
So you mentioned asymmetrical connections, and so one thing I talk about a lot is asynchronous versus synchronous following. And in the early days, it was very clear. In Facebook, I'm connected to Karen, Karen's connected to me, and it can't just be one way. In Twitter, it was never the case. So I could follow you, and you didn't have to know who I was, right? But I would see your updates, and I could respond to you.
Yeah.
And they've made it so that you can possibly only see responses from people who you've already connected to, or you can filter those down. But do you see that there's some kind of value? Does it even count as networking to just be aware of what other people are doing?
Yes, I mean, it's a part of it. Being aware and curious about what other people are doing is definitely a piece of connecting to people, because it just helps you it gives you context, right, for when you do have occasion to meet someone, or want to meet someone, that you have some, a little more context. And the context now is sort of richer than just the job history, right? If people have public accounts and you see that, a Google alum who's got an interesting approach in following is Hunter Walk, who's now a VC with Homebrew. And so he's posting, he and his wife and daughter go to a nail salon and they all get their nails painted, and he's wherever he is. And so you meet him and you think, oh yeah, he went to the Museum of Ice Cream, or, he posted something funny. That's fair game for a person you've never met, because he posted it and it's public, and you have a little bit of ground to be common on together, that you can sort of meet in the middle and be kind of sociable about it, personable.
Well, you mentioned that. So in your book, you talk a lot about, doing the minimum standard to get into one of these networks, but you have to be authentic. You can't just tweet a few links and then disappear. But you also have people on the other side of the spectrum who share everything, right? And they don't stop, and you mute them or do everything, but they just continue and continue, because there's different personalities that take place in all these networks, including, I think you said, be it the communicator, or the person who pontificates and makes comments and everything.
Yes.
How do you find your lane? Do you just know what it is?
I mean, no, okay, I tried out now my favorite quote from the book from a guy named Ivan Meisner, which is, think of networking less like hunting and more like farming. Or if you like, substitute gardening for farming. So the idea is you're nurturing, you're watering, you're planting, you're trimming, you're weeding, you're plowing under, you're replanting. Where hunting is very transactional, shall we say, a one hit. And so you don't. I mean, I kind of built my online connections over time just by, this person's interesting. I have something in common with them. They're interested in the same things I am. I didn't meet them maybe at Google, but I followed them. I know what they're doing now. I want to be connected. I mean, it's a long game, right? And it's a sort of ongoing process of cultivation and nurturing.
Sure. And you talk a lot about loose connections.
Yeah.
And so when you look at these loose connections, first of all, you can define what that means. Mm-hmm. And then second, for people who are loose connection who might not have a direct overlap with a job, does that matter? Like, do engineers need to connect to marketing people?
I would never mandate such a thing. No, I mean, it's based on sort of who you like. I find an interesting thing, though, that the time since I've left Google to me is such a world-class network of people, past and present. I mean, literally at the door here, a guy waved that I worked with 15 years ago. Maybe the last time saw him 8 or 10 years ago. And, he couldn't stay today. I'm going to follow up and just say, I missed you. How are you? It's very, it can be very intermittent, and there's no prescription about, roles or history even. It's more just who do you like, what associations you might have with a place. I'm sure a company that fosters and encourages collaboration and cross-team work and relationships and friendships does better in the long-term networking realm than one that is very siloed. Just a guess. And
you talk specifically about all hands where people flew in from around the globe and met here, and you still have relationships today.
Yeah.
But the reality is, both you and I had dogs, and wouldn't we rather walk a dog around the park 2 times than go to some event in the city and walk around the room for 2 times? I'd rather walk the dog.
Yeah.
So, do I have to go to this corporate party?
Okay, so a global offsite is not probably an optional thing. Mm-hmm. It's different than the holiday party, I would say. You probably do have to participate fully in the offsite, and that's probably a good thing all around. I do write about corporate parties because they're not really networking opportunities, I don't think. They may or may not be obligatory, but they are more of a political statement, perhaps. And by that I mean not at a company this big, but at smaller companies, you need to be seen as a team player, right? You need to be, kind of part of the group and going along with things. So in a small company, it's not for fun. It really is a work obligation to go to the holiday party. What I say in the book is you do not have to stay all night at the company party. Make sure you're seen by a couple of the people you need to be seen by, and then make an exit. But they're not the same thing.
No, absolutely
right?
not.
Yeah.
But no, I was just bridging.
Okay.
Okay. So you also mentioned in the book that the people that you need aren't always those who are doing the hiring. So can you explain that?
Yeah. In fact, mostly, you know how it works. I mean, mostly, if your friend says, I've already applied and I'd love to meet the hiring manager, that's just not going to happen. That's just not how it works, especially in a big company. You don't meet the hiring manager before many other steps happen. But you may want intel about a team or the manager of the team or the future of the product line or what the dynamics are of the group, and do they have cooperation from the other surrounding groups. You may want all kinds of intel about what it's like to work there and who the other people are and all that kind of stuff. So that's That's, no one person is going to have like, here is the entire answer to your job quest. I know everything that you need to know about it. It's going to be, like I said, a long game. One person has this piece of the puzzle. Somebody knows about the product viability or has strong opinions about it that are somewhat informed. And, someone else has been on the team for a while. Someone else can tell you maybe the history of how the group has evolved. Different people along the way that you might meet. And so that's how it's like a journalism effort, really. You're kind of the reporter trying to put together a story for yourself that makes sense and that informs your interviews when you get to that point.
And so one thing that has happened, when you started at Google, it was literally 17 years ago. Right?
Yeah.
And so the company's changed, but so have the products that are being offered,
For
and
sure.
so is the technology.
Yeah.
And so I think about this sometimes. My previous role in the previous company, I once asked to have everybody's birthdays so that we could publish them in an internal newsletter. The enterprising HR person who responded not only sent me everyone's birthdays, but included their birth year, and then sorted it from oldest to youngest. And I was down at the bottom. I was like the third youngest person in the company. Now, clearly, personally identifiable information, big mistake. But I'm no longer the third youngest person in the company.
Right.
Neither are you.
Right.
And as things have changed, you talked about the fact that 60 is the new 40. But also, it's really hard to reboot your career at age 40 or 50 or 60.
Yeah, for sure.
So is networking more important because the world is changing underneath it, or are you just going to hold on to your people and move forward?
Honestly, I have to say it's more important. Holding on and sort of, hoping no one's really noticing has a limited success rate, right? Where if you continue, if you have a growth mindset, if you're curious, if you're willing to evolve, if you're open to learning new things, open to meeting new people, open to having new thoughts, that's the thing that keeps you going. Correct? And in a way, I used to joke that I was the oldest person at Google at the time because I am older than Eric. However, then Google hired Vint Cerf. And Vint is older than I am. And so he became kind of an inspiration for me because he's awesome and like an insane world traveler in his three-piece suits. So it's really not, we all have age discrimination. I do too. I will characterize someone as being too old. And I mean, it's in their mind. It's like they don't have a growth mindset, I guess is maybe the way to say it. But we all have to kind of watch for that, but I think the answer, if you fear it, is better step out a little wider rather than kind of hope no one notices me.
Sticking with demographics that are uncomfortable for 800, Alex.
Yeah.
You are female. And so as a woman who's networking, those are, you talked about Twitter being a really hostile place for women sometimes, and you kind of railed against it. I'm not talking about while you worked there, but as a platform.
Yeah, I meant as a
just
platform,
to clarify.
Yeah.
But as a female who's outwardly networking, do you find that it's easier than what you think your male counterparts are having it, or is it harder? Do you find that going out for coffee or sending an email
to a stranger
sometimes gets the wrong response, or people looking at it in the wrong way?
So to me, for me, where I am, and I'm 67. So for me, the age factor has kind of trumped the woman factor, and in a way that's lucky. I think it's very interesting because I was considered, maybe an anomalous person who worked in Silicon Valley, but nonetheless someone who kind of fit in and had been around a long time. I had some credibility. So that helped me. I was not party to a bunch of uncomfortable exchanges. On the other hand, when you're older, you're also more invisible. And in a way, I find that kind of a superpower because nobody pays attention to you. And if you're a woman, they're also not listening to what you're saying in a meeting, which is not always good. But at the same time, it's kind of interesting. Maybe it all ties to being an introvert because I observe and I watch and I kind of take my own counsel and kind of react later. But I can observe the scene and watch how people are. But I do think that for me personally, I'm sure I wasn't seriously considered certain times in my career, not just at Google by any means, for different roles or something, because some guy was friends with another guy. I'm sure that has happened. But at the same time, I made my own way, and I think, honestly, being kind of a few years ahead was beneficial to me, oddly, and never really got in my way at all at Google or Twitter, for that matter. And earlier on, I was at a lot of smaller companies and, computer publications where there wasn't as much of an age consciousness gap at that time. And it didn't have this yet, so maybe that made a difference too.
Mm-hmm. So when you introduced your book in Mountain View, this was about a couple of months ago?
Oh yeah, Books Inc.
At a book signing. So I asked you a question, which I'm going to repeat, so you're already ready for this one. So at Twitter, you tweet. You have 140 characters. Now it's 280. Maybe you're able to add a photo, but it's pretty concise and you're owned by the container. And a blog is more open-ended, but it's not 100 pages.
Right.
Your book is. So how did you take on this uncomfortable challenge of having to write for long form? And obviously what you're doing is kind of like a book tour and a book signing tour. These are probably outside your comfort zone because you haven't done it before.
Right.
How'd you do it?
Well, I knew enough about publishing to say if I get an agent and they sell a proposal, I'm in. I'm going to follow this adventure. I know what's generally entailed here. I'll do it. I just thought that. I did know it would be a problem to write long because I'm not used to writing long. I've written for online, 1,000 words is more than enough most of the time. So I get the contract and it says 60 to 80,000 words. And I thought, I'm just not going to pay attention to that right now. I can't. But the simple answer to writing long is you just have to break it down. So I would pay attention not to the meta length and, I would be more like I had to learn how to make a good outline, which I hadn't done since school. And then literally go to the outline and say, okay, that's next, and then that's next. That was hard. That was really, butt in seat type work to make. And then one day, my editor said, let's just count up how far you are, and she I did it all in Google Docs, and so she just sort of did a rough count of every chapter. I was like, wow, I'm at 43,000 words already. So you will see, it's not a long book. There's sidebars with exercises. There's epigraphs for every chapter, because that's as long as it needed to be. And actually, that's what my editor told me too. I didn't have to kind of overly repeat, but it was a slog. It was something I had to learn. Same with going out and talking about it. In a way, I'm not, it's not my natural state, but if I had to do it for the rest of my life, I don't know, but for, some period of months or a year, I enjoy it because it's not constant and it's fun to talk about and especially to get the questions.
So you talk a lot about getting the first role at Google through people you know and using the network and helping other people forward. And similar at Twitter, someone you knew in your existing relationship got you there. So that sets up this kind of wall where people who don't know you can't get in. And when you talk about Google getting 1 million resumes a quarter or a day or whatever it looks like, it's a lot. So there's a two-piece on this. First, does that mean online job submissions are dead? And recruiters should just do something else? And then the third thing, which I'm concerned about, is if you're only getting in by who you know, doesn't that just cement the diversity problem that we already have?
That's a very good question. But I would say recruiters are not going away because there are still lots of jobs in the world that follow this, CV submission picked out of the pile, phone screening process that goes on. The question is really about the higher level jobs and the executive roles and the roles that are kind of built on relationships and have fostered relationships with other people in other places. That's an interesting thing to explore. For me personally, that's why I'm open to meeting everybody all the time and giving advice, even if I don't have direct advice. I will literally Google like a good how-to article and send it to someone and say, I can't help more than this, but this is a good source for what you need to do next or what you need to know. It is a very good question about the idea of, this sort of friends of friends. And I don't have a single good answer to that. I would say that the more people in hiring positions and incumbents at companies are aware of that, the more they broadly network, right, for roles, not just the old, example would be Ivy League is where the only place we go versus all of other kind of schools. Now I think we have to say that they don't all have to be four-year colleges. We want to look at a bunch of different variables. It's going to just be a piecemeal improvement, I think, where someone says we are determined to find, we're going to look in more sources, we're going to have a broader definition of the role, and we do not want, the friendly person that we already know we'd like to have a beer with in the, famous notion. In fact, I did interview an HR executive because this question of cultural fit has come up a lot, right? This kind of shorthand for, they fit with us, they're like us, that kind of thing. And she said that at least in her circle of HR and training and development people, they knew that was a bad construct, and they don't use that, they don't want to reference that. They think instead about one's cultural contribution to a company, which is could be narrowly defined, but hopefully is much more broadly defined as they have their passions and their interests, and they're not all the same, and they don't all match each other. They're more like they bring a richness, so they have a contribution to make culturally and socially, as well as the job skills. And I like that way of thinking about it, but it takes discipline to actually apply that in all the steps in a hiring process.
And so you often talk about having this large network of connections, but do you also have a really tight network of close connections where you can be unfiltered? And is that just a relief to not have to be this public face?
Well, for sure, but I'm not sure I'm this public face that much of the time, to be honest. I mean, we all do, when you actually get together with someone face to face, you're hopefully going to be more personal and more, unfiltered than even watching what you tweet or something like that, or what you choose to write about. We all need that too. We need the intimacy of the actual, direct connection, as well as I think this broader world that helps us in a lot of things that we do.
So, Cliff, I think we have the option for anyone else in the audience who's live to ask questions if you do have them.
So you mentioned Levy, who's great. What other reporters were good to work with, and who was bad to work with?
Well, I mean, actually, it's interesting. The whole scene has changed so much. It used to be there were the big mainstream outlets and then a bunch of bloggers. And now we can't really make that differentiation as the same way. So Stephen Levy is a wonderful long-form reporter and not a sort of day-of scoop type reporter. There's actually too many to name who were covering Google, but most of maybe this is a fudging on the question, I don't know, but it's a relationship business too, right? It's ongoing conversations, and by the way, not just when you need something. I mean, it really, mirrors the same idea of connecting with people so that you can give context and be off the record and kind of let them know something's coming without saying what it is. And it's very much a good relationship network. I would say that the publications, have changed so much. BuzzFeed and Vox is, these are things that didn't exist a few years ago. Vice sometimes. There are many more outlets than the mainstream. The reporters change though, because they're not in long-term stable jobs for the most part. And so they move around. So someone like Mike Isaac, for example, kind of cut his teeth a little bit at Recode and Wired. And now he's at the New York Times, finishing his book on Uber, which we're all waiting for. So, the cast of characters in a way has changed, and some of the practice has changed because it's not about, years before even Google, for a long time in PR, it was the long form, which was magazines that were 3 months out, the short form, which was newspapers, and then here came this other thing, the blogs, right? And it's like, it's just so much a different landscape now.
I was wondering what your perspective was on networking events where it's, because you talk a lot about the current relationships where you're working with someone,
Yeah.
but where it's there's a networking event that someone's hosting, whether would you attend it or not, or what your take is?
If it was really just the purpose of this event is to meet people and come home with business cards or contacts beamed between phones, I'd question. That's like a weird speed dating kind of thing. And that's why I think people hate the idea of networking, is that's what they think of as hotel ballroom. I'm going to make myself stay 30 minutes and I'm going to come away with 3 business cards or, whatever. That's what, but if it was a conference, then that's a little different, where there may be common interest. You might be there for a day or two. You're going to have a little small talk with this one and that one. There might be a legitimate moment of connection. You wouldn't do a whole networking thing there. You'd follow up. But that's more natural than just network to find your next job at this event that is about that. I think I wouldn't do that personally. And I think they're painful, those things. I don't know, has anyone had a good experience at one of those? Does anyone do those?
If I could ask you to summarize the whole book in one formula, what would it be?
Well, it wouldn't be a formula, because I'm a liberal arts major. Well, it might be this guy's quote, Ivan Meisner, networking is more like farming than hunting, to paraphrase. In other words, it's seasonal, it's a long game, and you're continuing to tend it. So, in essence, I think that would be what I'd say. The other thing I might add is people want to help each other. It's just you have to give context and have some kind of richness around what you're seeking or asking. But people like to help each other if they can.
When you reach out to people, and as an introvert, I have a problem where you don't know what to say. You don't have a purpose in mind. What do you do then? And if you reach out to people, do they always respond to you? Especially with people where you have nothing really you need to say, and you don't know each other that well.
I think I'd wonder why you're reaching out in the first place. Is it what would make you reach out to someone you don't know?
In general, because
someone tells you it's a good idea to make more contacts. Okay. You still need context, right? So if it's just LinkedIn kind of set this up in a way that is, I guess, somewhat useful, but not entirely useful, right? Where it's you send somebody that canned language, I'd like to join your network. Don't do that, right? Don't just send the canned message that's not from you. They make it easy to overwrite that and say, I'm interested in your career as a product manager. I'm interested in how you got to that company, or what you've written about something in AI. I want to know more about that. So you immediately bring some reason for it to the front, and that's when people are like, oh, that's kind of flattering, and maybe I will respond to that, however briefly. No, people do not always respond, and that's just kind of the way it goes, I think, the law of large numbers or something. If the more you're trying, I do find that the better, your odds are always better if you can say, I am a friend of so-and-so's, or even better, your friend introduces you. But beyond that, if you're just you say, I know someone has spoken highly of you, or I heard you talk, or I read your paper, I would love to have, 20 minutes, or could you respond to this and send me a link to your paper? Or could we have a 20-minute call? Or if we're both local, could I buy you coffee one day, or something like that. That it's like not a heavy obligation for them. There's not a time limit, and you're saying, I'd really like to know more. And maybe you don't ask it all at once. Maybe it's just, may I ask you a few questions about this thing? And I think people will respond if they have that kind of context. Maybe it's not as full as you'd like, or sometimes people will say, yeah, actually, I'm based on who you are and your background, yeah, I would love to talk shop with you about it, because I can see you have some background that's related, something like that. So, but you do bring something. You're not asking a favor in the sense of, please help me. You're just saying, I'd like to know more, or this interests me. Can you, would you take time to tell me more? It's not like I need a job and I have to apply tomorrow. That will not get a good response most of the time.
Hi, thanks for coming. So when I read about the history of companies like Google and Twitter and all these other technology companies, how they were started, how they were founded, it's usually a story about a small handful of people who somehow know each other and then make this great company. And when when you read about like, oh, how do you start a startup? It always skips that step. It's always like, you have your team, and now make your startup. Here's the steps. How you get venture capital funding, and all these other things. How do you go from having this network that you've cultivated to having like a team that you can use to actually take steps to start things like this? It's
a very good question. I mean, I'm only speaking as an observer here of the same history you're talking about, but it seems like probably the first thought isn't a company, but like, is it a product? Is it a thing we can make that's interesting? If it's engineers and technical people, and money doesn't come into it for a while. But it's more like, is this a good idea? Is this something, either interesting or groundbreaking, or does something different with technology in some way? Google's pretty unusual in that most companies don't have sort of an early team of employees that is as cohesive for as long as has been the case at Google. That's really rare, I think. And so typically it's more like, the Beatles, where it's like, it was Stu Best, but he died, Stu Sutcliffe, he died, and then it was Pete Best, but he didn't kind of work out, and we didn't like him, and so then it was Ringo. It's like, when I read about companies starting, it's often, okay, this was the beginning, and then, in fact, I just met a guy who said, I was part of a startup, it was successful, but I realized I didn't want to do it, so I bailed. I sold my half to the other ones, and I'm out. People shift around, but essentially it does come from either we have a good idea because we've been fooling around together and come up with something, or in a lot of cases now, it's like we worked somewhere on something before, but we always had this thing we talked about as a thing we'd like to try. But there are so many steps between that and, even VC or anything, becoming a company. I mean, lots, don't obviously get that far. But it is interesting what you're saying, though, about it is kind of your personal network of people you know well at first, right? You're not, discovering people on Instagram for your company. It's people you know and trust in the beginning, and, think deeply about stuff. And then, it's a long, long journey after that, I think. And so how that happens, we're lucky to live in a place and in a time when there's so many things that are like incubators and, angel investors and small accelerators and things that are for very early stage, just fooling around, startups that are not formulated at all, but it's a few people trying to figure something out. And by the way, they're networking and talking to other people and testing out their ideas. So it's very hit and miss, but I think that's what, makes it seem.
It's a small conversation that turns into an idea.
Yeah, it's a good way of saying it. It's great to be here, really great.